folks, Merrick Garland does not party, okay?
Welcome to FindLaw's Don't Judge Me, the show about the law in real life. I'm Laura Temmie, and got a skeleton crew today. I'm joined by Andy Leonetti.
How?
Fantastic. That's it. That's all we need from you. I'm moving on. And and Joe Fawbush.
Hi, everybody. Yeah.
You had one chance, and I'm not going to let you do it
God.
again. See, This is what happens when Allie takes an episode off. We can't even get our intros right, but we're going to do our best.
I can only speak in syllables, not complete words, I guess. You know, those out there in listener land don't understand literally how hard it is just to say a frickin' word when the microphone is in front of your face.
It does, it does change things. That's for sure.
I'm like, am I going to say hi, howdy doody? What was I even going for there? It just a noise.
Yeah.
Anything but howdy doody is acceptable.
I was going to say you should do howdy doody every time.
No.
You know, it helps to pick one and stick with it, because then, you know. Anyway, what are we talking about today?
We're going to talk about drugs.
Yes!
This
so
podcast
excited.
is brought to you by Thomson Reuters.
I do really like that we're going to do, 40 minutes to an hour of three nerds talking about drugs. Like,
I will say, actually, this podcast, just to be safe, this podcast is brought to you by Thomson Reuters.
Yes. FindLaw and the host do not condone any illegal behavior at all.
Yeah, I figured I'd start with a show of hands asking who here is down with drugs and really likes this.
down with drugs.
So we do want to talk. Yeah, I don't know either. So none of us are currently under the influence of illegal drugs at the moment. But with a new president in office, I thought this would be a really exciting time to talk about one of the more popular consumer legal topics that we encounter in the across the FindLaw family of legal information websites.
Well, there was a lot of interesting stuff that came out of the election as far as states changing their regulations. So I'm excited to talk about it.
A lot of developments there as well. But I think I want to start firmly with the seemingly growing by the day expectation that the country's oldest and squarest president in its history is gonna be the guy to usher in a new wave of the liberalization of federal drug laws.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but I do really enjoy that. It's almost as funny as, a former DARE role model talking about drugs.
Yeah. Oh.
Anybody else remember DARE?
Were you a DARE role model?
I was. Although from what I remember, it pretty much consisted of one day when I was a senior in high school hanging out with fifth graders. And I'm not sure if we even talked to them about drugs, to be honest. Like I remember playing basketball with them. And that was it.
I can't pinpoint the time for me, but I just remember at some point DARE just like kind of morphing into Just Say No, and then we never said the word dare again. And we were always just like Just Say No related stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I think Andy and I can talk about the war on drugs that was kind of we were right there for the beginning of it.
Mm-hmm.
It was frightening.
Yeah. Yeah. So I
For
I
you
think
personally, or just in general?
No, not for me personally, not at all. But the police who came to school all the time made it sound extremely frightening.
a lot of Saved by the Bell episodes and Blossom and after school specials.
Yeah, and Full House and
Yeah.
like all those shows had a drug episode.
Yeah. It was kind of a thing. If you were a show in the late 80s, you had to have a very special episode about drugs.
Sure. So I guess this is this our after school special? Is that what's happening?
This is a very special episode of Don't Judge Me.
Talking about legal shrooms.
But it's hard not to talk about liberalizing drug laws without thinking of this stuff too, without thinking of like stuff from the 80s and 90s, because Joe Biden is 78 years old, and in the 80s and 90s, it was kind of hard to find someone in Congress who wanted to crack down on drug users and drug pushers harder than Joe Biden. And maybe that's only because he was in the majority throughout all of the 80s or throughout most of the 80s and early 90s at least. And so as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, he was front and center on a lot of war on drugs. And then really in the 90s, it became just like war on anything even tangentially related to crime with the Clinton crime bill. Man, Joe Biden did not like drugs.
He did not
at all
like them.
But conveniently, his views have evolved since then.
Sometimes you gotta see the writing on the wall and just go with it,
Yeah. And during this campaign, he did finally say something along the lines of, I don't think anyone should go to jail for smoking marijuana, which, thanks, Joe. Yeah. Also, he didn't say anything about like whether you should go to jail for preparing or eating really dank brownies.
I don't think I've ever heard you use the word dank.
but yeah, I'm showing my age. I don't know if kids these days use dank anymore as like
I have no idea.
As a weed term.
We don't need to pretend to be cool with it. It's all right.
That's, when people start talking about shrooms, my response is usually portobellos are nice. Like I don't have any experience with that.
But what I found is that the latest Gallup survey shows now across the US, across all political parties, everything, 68% support for marijuana legalization. And that's talking full legalization. So especially this century, the mood of the country has shifted a ton. So I think the president still has a little catching up to do.
So maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but I'm just curious that, I kind of figured that was the mood of the country, but how many states have actually legalized recreational marijuana? I mean, it's still only a handful, right?
Yeah, we are at recreational 15 states now that are fully legalized.
Oh, that's more than I realized.
Well, and I think there's only 3 left where it's not legal in any form.
Yeah, we should rephrase the answer a little differently. Now, in the country, we only have Idaho, Wyoming, Kansas, Tennessee, Alabama, and South Carolina where marijuana is fully illegal. We have, a fairly large amount of states that have only decriminalized it, and then we have more states that have legalized medical marijuana, and then we are now up to 15 states, though, that have legalized recreational marijuana. It went undefeated this last election day. on the ballot, with 68% approval in Mississippi for medical marijuana. South Dakota voters, 69% approval for medical marijuana. And then they also voted with 53% approval for recreational marijuana. Arizona, 60%. New Jersey, 67%. And Montana, 57%, all on election day. So recreational programs are obviously not up and running in those states yet, but they will be at some point in the next year or two. The even bigger votes we saw occur on election day were in Oregon. Voters approved 59 to 41%, the first ever ballot initiative to decriminalize the non-commercial possession of controlled substances. So that includes pretty much any Schedule 1, Schedule 2 drugs, which I have the list here handy. Schedule 1 includes heroin, LSD, pot, ecstasy, methaqualone, and peyote. And Schedule 2, which is most of prescription painkillers, cocaine, methamphetamine, Adderall, Ritalin. So those are going to be... it essentially reduces the maximum penalty for possessing small amounts of any of these drugs to a $100 fine. And you can even avoid the fine by participating in a health assessment. I think that still needs to be...
Do we have any idea what that entails?
I think the health assessment still needs to be fleshed out.
Okay.
Are you okay?
Yeah, you're like, yeah, I guess so. I was just buying a little cocaine. You know,
walking around with a pocket full of meth. What do you think?
Yeah.
They're like, oh, okay, we'll waive that fine then. The state though is also diverting a lot of its sales tax funds from recreational marijuana sales to fund rehab and treatment.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, this is huge.
Yeah, and voters in Oregon did not stop there though either. With 56% approval, they became the first state in the nation to legalize psilocybin, which is also better known as magic mushrooms.
All right.
Yeah. This is what they voted to set up is you can't just walk around taking shrooms and tripping wherever you want. This is legalizing tripping in a supervised therapeutic setting. So this was the effort was led by a husband and wife pair of psychotherapists. Mm-hmm. They led the effort to get this on the ballot, saying that using shrooms in a controlled setting holds promise for addiction, depression, anxiety, some other mental health conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard of like I think it's microdosing with mushrooms on to help with several different mental health issues, especially like bipolar and that kind of thing. So it's kind of fascinating.
Ooh, I keep hearing about this microdosing thing, and I never know.
I mean, I
never
don't know
what
exactly.
Yeah,
what
I
it
never know what
entails.
to make of it because I only ever hear about it from not doctors. People are
Right,
like,
yeah.
"Have you ever looked
I'm
into
sure
Have you ever
there
looked
are.
into microdosing?"
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, obviously, I am not a mental health professional, and half the people talking about microdosing aren't mental health professionals. But I have heard of people doing it, the advice of, someone who has that knowledge.
Yeah, it became kind of a trend, especially in tech companies, where people felt like they would be able to be more creative in taking small doses throughout the day. I have significant doubts that,
Seems a little dubious.
But yeah, that is but I mean, they have been using psilocybin in psychological experiments since the 60s and, even as a treatment since the 60s. So that's not necessarily a new idea. But yeah, that was actually really surprising to me. I know that the mood is shifting on marijuana, but legalizing and decriminalizing the harder drugs, I would have to guess that most of America is still hesitant to do that. Yeah. So I will be interested to see. But, of course, Oregon is kind of proud of itself for paving the way on these sorts of issues.
On the shrooms issue, too, Washington, D.C. voters also voted to decriminalize possession of shrooms.
Interesting.
So you leave it to the cities, I guess, or Washington, D.C., the laboratory of democracy.
So, Andy, I think you've been following it more closely than I have. I don't necessarily know the new administration's position on decriminalization. Have they talked about changes in policy at the DOJ? Are they actually going to try to get something through Congress? Do you know, do they have any plans or?
Well, so here's all anyone can kind of go off of is what Joe Biden said during the campaign, which was basically like, I guess if you want to toke a little doobie, it's, but.
Thanks, Grandpa.
Did he say that in his aviator shorts?
Yeah.
Is that what?
Folks, if you listen, if you want to smoke a doobie, I'm fine with it. But anything beyond that is still kind of up in the air. He did, with his appointments, though, of Merrick Garland as AG and Javier Becerra to be HHS secretary, they both have been on the record as at least being unopposed to liberalizing marijuana laws. I will start straight out. I have looked a lot into this. I will start straight out. Anybody who's hoping for like cocaine or heroin or anything like that to be decriminalized, do not count on it.
Yeah.
in the definitely within the next 4 years. I would put chances of that happening at less than zero.
Yeah.
But
it would still be huge to see people stop being incarcerated for marijuana.
Yeah. So when it comes to marijuana, the big thing that happened at the end of last year was the House passed what's being known as the MORE Act. That was essentially descheduled marijuana completely and set up and also funded some medical marijuana research. It would make it easier for legal marijuana businesses to access commercial banking, like lines of credit and even like checking accounts, which in some states pot business owners have trouble getting access to. But when that and Chuck Schumer said during the campaign season that if Democrats were able to regain the Senate majority, they would also, the MORE Act would come up for a vote in the U.S. Senate in this new Congress. And the House would, of course, have to pass it again. So only 5 Republicans crossed the aisle on that House vote. And so 5 GOP votes in the House does not even come close to indicating that you will be able to get 10 Republican Senate votes to get past the 60 vote threshold on a legislative filibuster. I guess that's up in the air. That's a whole different can of worms.
That's its own show.
If the filibuster for legislation goes bye-bye, then you might have a better chance at the MORE Act actually getting an actual up or down vote in the Senate. You would definitely have some Democrats uncomfortable with it in the Senate, but there would be a couple Republicans who I could see maybe voting for it, like Rand Paul, maybe like Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, but not many, I don't think.
No, that seems right to me. I think, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't, I'm not going to be holding my breath for any kind of significant drug legislation to pass. I think it's still just navigating the existing structure between the states and the federal.
Yeah, what is likely to happen is the House will vote to pass it again, and then the Senate will vote to break a filibuster. It'll fail, and that'll be that. And then you turn to some piecemeal legislation. And from what I was gathering, doing my reading last week, pretty much the only thing that enjoys like overwhelming bipartisan support right now is funding medical marijuana research to actually prove its effectiveness is actually a huge step forward in and of itself. Actually, they might be able to make some changes to federal banking laws that allows like multi-state operating legal weed companies to more easily access bank services, but that doesn't really affect users of drugs at all. That's more the
right.
that affects the wealthy hipsters who overwhelmingly dominate the wealthy white hipsters who overly dominate the legal weed industry.
Mm-hmm.
That is a significant problem for them, though, because it does create all sorts of issues, including with the IRS.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard to feel too sympathetic, but, it does have a shuddering effect, maybe is what I can't remember what word I was going to use, but it does have the tendency of making it harder for dispensaries to do business.
Yeah, especially when some of these states that have created legal weed programs. I know when Illinois created theirs a couple years ago, they were very big on touting how they were going to be equitable in business licensing and things like that, really focusing on communities like the south and west sides of Chicago that just got hollowed out under the drug war. They were going to really focus on people from those community, entrepreneurs in those communities getting, first dibs at opening pot shops. So far, that has not happened. Surprise, surprise. And I know in Michigan, that's been a problem too, but Detroit doesn't even allow legal pot businesses. So they have recused themselves from the state's legal weed program.
Now that I think about it, we haven't provided yet an overview about the various approaches that the states are taking, right? Because it's kind of, states are taking a piecemeal approach to how to deal with marijuana. There's just full criminalization. There's decriminalization, where it's not legal to sell or to run a dispensary, but you won't be charged if you've got a small amount in your possession. And then there's full recreational legalization, where you can run a dispensary. It's like going to a liquor store. And then there's also the medical marijuana, where you can get it, and there can be dispensaries, but you need a prescription in order to get it, like you would with any other controlled substance, like a prescription painkiller.
Yeah. And some states too, in their, you have the citizens overwhelmingly vote to create a program, and then you leave it to the state to set up a regulatory framework over the next year or two, and it just becomes a joke. It took Massachusetts years to get one store open in the state. But in the meantime, people were then allowed to grow a couple plants in their home. Everybody with those Aero Garden lights that you can see in apartment windows everywhere now.
Are those the purple ones?
Yeah, those aren't the those are the red, white, and blue ones that you see all the time now.
Oh, okay.
Those are Aero Garden lights, which I assume some people are just growing pot in them.
Oh, probably.
Yeah, and you have some states like Colorado who, if anyone here has ever been to Denver, like you just see the absolute ubiquitousness of pot shops on like every block, and then other states try to like really, really control it, where they say, there will only be one marijuana shop per zip code or things like that. And it's a mess of different regulations and programs.
Yeah, and we should, to follow up on the discussion between, I know this is kind of pretty common knowledge, but just so that we're all on the same page, states even that have legalized marijuana, it is still against federal law. And as we discussed, federal law is not likely to change. And so at any point, federal law trumps state law. So at any point, the Department of Justice could start going after any, dispensary.
Yeah, the DEA could decide to raid a dispensary anytime they wanted.
Yeah. So there is still definite risk, even in states that are fully legalized, and there is still risk. I mean, in the next 4 years, there's no risk, but absent an actual act of Congress, this could change again in 4 years, depending on what happens politically.
Right. When Attorney General Jeff Sessions, also not a big fan of drugs, pretty much laid off the legal weed industry. That's a pretty good sign of, I guess, what people can expect to happen from the federal government. But you're right. It doesn't mean that nothing could happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then again, with some of the tax issues and with, some of the banking issues that dispensaries face, it is actually a very tricky legal area for a lot of dispensaries, which is why a lot of attorneys are getting into practicing law just specifically over marijuana, just to navigate some of these banking and some of these federal rules, And so there's still, even in a state that has legalized marijuana, it's still a complex question when you say, is this legal? Just because it's legal doesn't necessarily mean you can smoke it everywhere, for example. Some states prohibit smoking outside. Some people prohibit smoking it inside.
Near schools.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not really a free-for-all. So even, if you're listening and you're excited because you like marijuana, I feel morally obligated to say, still be careful.
I will say that absent legislation passing to reschedule or deschedule marijuana from the category of to reschedule it to Schedule 2, which would classify marijuana as a drug with an accepted medical use, but a high propensity for abuse and the need for oversight, which, like I said earlier, would put it on a par with like oxycodone, fentanyl, Vicodin, drugs that actually do require a great deal of oversight. Just to do that would require absent legislation, which we've already discussed is not going to happen. There is a very convoluted administrative path to rescheduling. The Federal Controlled Substances Act does allow a very it's a regulatory approach to rescheduling marijuana. Put it out there, Joe Biden cannot issue an executive order to reschedule marijuana. That is not something that can happen. But what can happen administratively is I have this giant flow chart open in front of me, courtesy of the Brookings Institute, I'm sorry, where either the Attorney General can review a petition, or an interested outside party or the Secretary of Health and Human Services files a petition with the Attorney General. And then the Attorney General will review this petition, and then they forward it to the Secretary of Health and Human Services with a request for scientific and medical evaluation. At which point HHS, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, will then start basically a scientific process of looking at evidence of the pharmacological effects of the drugs, of marijuana. They will look at current knowledge that exists on it. They will assess public health risks, chances for dependence and addiction. They will look at any potential benefits, blah, blah, blah. And then the secretary will issue recommendation to the attorney general. And so at which point they could recommend that it is not a controlled substance, essentially descheduling it, or if they should rescheduling it. And then the Attorney General will initiate more rulemaking proceedings for control, transfer, all the criminal aspects of possession of marijuana, selling, interstate transport, any of that stuff. So people who want to go that route, you should also be aware then that once like HHS, FDA, and the Department of Justice get involved, the likelihood of a lot of onerous regulations being put in place along with the legalization of weed may make it, careful what you wish for there as well.
Well, and not to mention court challenges, excuse me, and all of the stuff that goes along with administrative law. So, I mean, the process that you just described could be similar for a lot of different hot button issues, and it's always a long process, and it's always difficult, and there are legal challenges all the time. So, yeah. Again, don't hold your breath.
Yeah. Merrick Garland has kind of signaled that he would be like maybe okay with it, but like folks. Merrick Garland does not party, okay? So I wouldn't get your hopes up too much. Also, you have tens of thousands of career staff at DOJ, the DEA, who may very much not be in favor of decriminalizing or any sort of legalization efforts, and who can also do a lot of things to slow roll any regulatory efforts, anything like that as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like we can pretty much expect more of the same at the federal level. And meanwhile, the American population has made up its mind for the most part. And states are coming along kind of slowly but surely.
Yeah, with that vote in Oregon too, at some point with the way the opioid epidemic has just thrashed states like Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia, I wonder if you may see a ballot effort there to decriminalize the possession of certain controlled substances like heroin or fentanyl or oxy. It could happen.
Maybe now is a good time then to talk about one of those efforts to deal with the opioid problem that happened in Philadelphia, where they tried to open a drug safe house.
Yeah.
So this was a nonprofit that's, concerned about the amount of damage that opioids are doing to communities and individuals. We've been joking around about drugs, but, obviously they do cause serious problems, and we're not trying to make light of the actual damage that drugs do. And opioids is a huge problem, particularly in those states that you mentioned, Andy. And one creative theory is to let people who are already using drugs and regularly go to a safe place where they can be monitored after their use, and this would reduce opioid deaths, because, of course, this is a horrible problem in our country. 100 people die of an overdose every day. And so this is a nonprofit. They'd open up a drug safe house. People could come, use their drug of choice, and then they would have be monitored, and they could be given medication if they started to overdose. And while they were there, they would have access to, social workers, maybe talk about whether they could get housing. They could talk about treatment and recovery options. And so there was kind of trying to take a more holistic approach to dealing with, not the selling of drugs, but the using of drugs, kind of trying to lower the demand, where it's like, you've got a mental health issue going on with your addiction. Let's take care of that. And we're not going to criminalize it, but we're just going to have a safe place for it.
So a methadone clinic on steroids.
Basically, yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah, but the thing is, then you could actually go use your drug there. As it is, you can't do that. So the problem with this approach of having a drug safe house is that obviously it violates federal law. And under federal law, you cannot operate a premises where people come to use drugs. You can't sell drugs. You can't use drugs. You can't advertise that you can come there and use drugs.
What if you could advertise, but you just couldn't
That'd be
sell?
wild.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not surprising that there's a law like this on the books.
Yeah.
And so the Third Circuit said, nice try. And there was actually a dissent in this case. It's a very recent case out of the Third Circuit. Just came out, I think, a couple weeks ago. And there was a dissent saying that, no, we don't need to read into the law what you're reading into it, and it would be perfectly legal. But as it stands, Philadelphia cannot operate this drug safe house, or the nonprofit in Philadelphia cannot operate it. But there's some interesting workarounds that you could do. Like, for example, since you can't operate a premises where people come to use drugs, you could theoretically have a mobile van where you just kind of drive around.
Oh, sure.
If you give the van a call,
It's like calling an Uber.
Like the Breaking Bad RV.
yeah. So there. I mean, obviously you can't sell drugs, so nobody get any ideas listening. But if you're operating a methadone clinic, it's conceivable that there are some workarounds that you could do to help it this way. But as it stands, we're not going to have this decriminalization where you can just go to a safe place. Mm-hmm. I think the Third Circuit was probably right in its reading of the law, although there was some legitimate questions about it. But yeah, absent federal legislation, which, as we've already indicated, is not very likely.
The U.S. Senate doesn't party either.
No. Well, they don't like it when other people party.
That's very true.
Yeah, so I was excited about this because I do think it's a different approach, and I think it's a more common sense approach than, obviously the war on drugs has not worked. Not to give too much of my political opinion, but, it would be nice to be able to address the opioid crisis in a way that is a little different and just see if it gets better results. But absent changes at the federal level, that doesn't seem likely, unfortunately.
And that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of FindLaw's Don't Judge Me. Please subscribe to, rate, and review our show wherever you listen to podcasts. Check the show notes for related content. And if you'd like to contact us, send us an email at findlawpodcasts@thomsonreuters.com.
What meeting?
The meeting we're having right now.
Also, where am I? I heard drugs, and so then I just kind of showed up, and no, I just yeah.